The title of my talk is Citizenship, Race and Racism in Postcolonial France. And so what I thought I would do is just briefly talk about my first book and then talk about sort of my ongoing work from that work and sort of how my work has progressed since that book and kind of what I'm working on now and hopefully get some of your feedback. Okay. So the main question of my research, of my overall research agenda is how do citizens remain on the margins of mainstream society? And what does this reveal about how race and ethnicity operate in practice? So as I am an ethnographer, I want to center the lives and experiences of the folks that I work with. And I'm going to begin with an example of Safia, a 39-year-old journalist and novelist who I first met over a decade ago. One morning, she described her experiences growing up in France to Tunisian immigrant parents. She revealed the discrimination and mistreatment her parents experienced because of their immigrant status, lack of educational attainment, and illiteracy. Quote, I remember working really hard in school because I really wanted to escape my social background. I didn't want to be as poor as my parents or mistreated. Because when you don't know French perfectly well or have a certain level of education, especially when you're an immigrant, that's what happens. So I said to myself that when I grow up, it's out of the question to be treated like that. And I also worked hard because I wanted to earn a lot of money to help my parents, to have my parents be proud of me. So it was a bit of social retaliation there, end quote. So this only intensified as she grew older. As a law student, she remembers classmates calling her a quote unquote dirty Arab and telling her she should return to her country. However, she managed to be successful in her studies, earning both undergraduate and graduate degrees. She now works as a journalist and rents an apartment in Cergy-Pontoise, which is a Western banlieue or suburb, with her 2 young children and her husband, who was born to Algerian immigrant parents and works as a banker. There is much that makes her proud to be French, such as the values exemplified in the motto of liberté, égalité, fraternité. But she hates that her identity as a French person is often questioned by others. Quote, today when I'm with my children, people still ask me, what are your children's origins? Or where do you come from? That drives me crazy because my children were born in France to French parents. And me, I was born here. My children were born here and they still ask me that. It is so annoying to have to continually justify myself based on the color of my skin or the color of my children's skin, end quote. So Safia feels that her place in France is challenged because she is of North African or Maghreban origin. Reflecting on her status in French society, she feels that she is quote unquote French in the second degree. Despite her middle-class status and educational and professional accomplishments, she nonetheless feels she occupies a France that continually reminds her of how her ethnic origin excludes her from being accepted as French as anyone else.
Wait, so Jean, I'm sorry, are you advancing the PowerPoint? Because we just see the title slide.
Oh, yeah, I am. Why is it? Oh, no. I don't know what's happening. I'm advancing it. Let me see. Yeah, I don't know how to, like say, resume share. So you see, what do you see now? Sorry.
I just see this full screen with the photograph, but with the side view thumbnails and your tiny little notes at the bottom. So maybe you should stop sharing it.
Oh, that's, yeah. That's
or you chose the wrong thing to like.
Yeah, sorry. Let me try to do this again. Sorry.
It would not be a talk at the New School if there was not a technological problem in the middle of it.
Thanks for catching that.
Yeah, it wasn't me. It was actually Carolina Bankman-Yost. Thank you, Carolina.
Thank you, Carolina. Okay, let's see. What do you see now?
Now we see the first slide full screen.
Okay, and now do you see if I change it?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I don't know if I should go back. What should I?
No, I think it's fine. I mean,
okay.
I think you got it. Okay. We still know how to pay attention without visuals.
Okay, that's true. We're okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so I think I was here. I just read this quote. Okay, so let me just come back to this point. Okay, sorry about that. So Safia feels her place in France's challenge because she is of North African or Maghreb origin. Reflecting on her status in French society, she feels that she is quote unquote French in the second degree. Despite her middle class status and educational and professional accomplishments, she nonetheless feels she occupies a France that continually reminds her of how her ethnic origin excludes her from being accepted as French as anyone else. So, I'm assuming it's still working well because now I'm super paranoid. We'll only be able to think about this throughout the talk. Okay. So in a later conversation, she recounted a disturbing incident. So one day, Safia was traveling to Marseille in the south of France by train for some work-related meetings. She had no luggage with her since she was not spending the night and had only her work bag or satchel with her. When her train arrived back in Paris at Gare de Lyon at the end of the day, she was stopped leaving the train by a plainclothes police officer. He demanded to see what was inside her bag. She explained that he tutoyed her or addressed her using the informal tu form versus the formal vous form for you. She was offended that he did not immediately identify himself as a police officer, nor use the formal vous form when addressing her. He demanded to see her identification and asked her why she only had a work bag with her. Are you smuggling drugs? The officer asked. Are you a prostitute? Are you working for someone? Humiliated, Safia explained that she was a journalist who went to Marseille for some meetings and showed her personal identification, as well as the identification indicating the publication for which she works. The craziest thing she explained to me when her eyes welled up with tears was that the train was packed with people, with white people. There were a ton of white people, and I was the one stopped. No one said anything. The other passengers just stared at me, end quote. So she's currently pursuing legal means to address this incident, which, as she explained to me, has she seen happen to way too many racial and ethnic minorities in France. Quote, you can't just let these things go by. How can people not think this is wrong? Okay. And then I'm seeing some comments in the chat, but I'm gonna just, should I ignore those? No, okay, okay, perfect, it was fine. Okay, great. Okay. So Safia is one of the adult children of North African immigrants I discuss in my book, pictured here, Citizen Outsider, which was published in 2017. So based on ethnographic research and interviews with 45 middle-class adult children of Maghreban or North African immigrants, I discuss the intersections of race, ethnicity, and societal belonging in French society. I focus on the middle class segment of the second generation population and demonstrate how they are denied cultural citizenship, which would allow them to be accepted as French by others, solely because they're non-white. I frame this population as citizen outsiders, hence the title, a term which political scientist Kathy Cohen uses both to characterize the precarious social locations of Black American youth. This is a framework rooted in work by scholars including Du Bois, Fanon, and Patricia Hill Collins, who have all conceptualized how individuals can be members of a society, but simultaneously kept on the margins of that society, thereby complicating the relationship between race, citizenship, and belonging. So the middle class North African second generation is both inside and outside of the citizenry. They have made it, so to speak, but only to a certain point, as they are continually reminded of how their citizenship and belonging are quote unquote suspect and often questioned by others. These citizen outsiders are suspect at both micro and macro levels, from having their identities routinely checked by the police in public spaces or the contrôle d'identité, such as what Safia experienced on that train, to growing up with fewer representations of North African or Maghreban origin individuals in government or popular culture. To clarify terms, in this talk, I use the terms North African and Maghreban interchangeably. Following the lead of my interlocutors, I also use the term white throughout this talk, even though I recognize, to refer to people who are Français de souche or those of native French European origin, even though I recognize that white is not an officially used term in French society. Yet this is a term that, that my respondents use. Also, just as my respondents were citizen outsiders, I too, as a non-French American citizen doing research in France, was also an outsider. Yet in some ways, my identity as a Black woman created an insider connection with my respondents because they also perceive me as a racial and ethnic minority. My own race and identity were and are therefore directly implicated in conducting this research. To me, this further reveals how race manifests itself within French society through the various connections that my respondents made. And I'm happy to talk more about that specific point in the Q&A. This is a new slide. So why France? So France is a fascinating site for an analysis of these questions because of its continued disavowal of race and ethnicity as categories, as exemplified in its French Republican ideology. French republicanism emphasizes the relationship between individuals and the state over any other group categorization or identity. Being French is supposed to supersede any other identification, be it linguistic, religious, or ethnic. Race, as well as ethnicity, is not considered a legitimate category by the state. It is not measured in the French census. France, therefore, imagines and continually constructs itself as colorblind or race neutral. Yet, despite the Republican emphasis on the renunciation of racial and ethnic categorization, Frantz Fanon, as well as many scholars of French colonial history, have long argued that France has relied on racial and ethnic boundaries in constructing its national identity. Since France has a long history of colonial slavery, colonialism, and related subsequent migration to the quote unquote metropole, it is necessary, therefore, to understand how individuals who are descendants of these structures fare in contemporary French society. So I use the framework of cultural citizenship as a corrective to theories of immigrant incorporation and assimilation for the second generation. Cultural citizenship signifies a claim to belonging that is accepted by others, that would allow an individual to traverse the cultural symbolic boundaries around a particular national identity, or in this particular case, enable children of North African immigrants to be seen as truly French by others. Cultural citizenship is particularly interesting or relevant in France, as citizenship status is something that is supposed to supersede all markers of difference. My approach to cultural citizenship is informed by, among others, legal scholar Letty Volpe, who has emphasized how citizenship is automatically constituted by specific cultural values, and anthropologist Renato Rosaldo, who conceives of cultural citizenship as the right to be different without being denied belonging. This approach challenges notions of citizenship as the salient boundary, marking us versus them, as articulated by Brubaker, Lamont, and others. I push this further by demonstrating how the North African second generation is excluded despite their legal citizenship status. Citizenship status is not a significant marker of inclusion and exclusion, as children of immigrants experience marginalization similar to that of their immigrant parents solely because they're not white. So my interlocutors are technically part of France, yet continually kept and reminded that they're kept on the margins of mainstream society. This exclusion cannot be explained by their socioeconomic status, as they are middle class, well educated, and hold professional jobs, and are upwardly mobile as compared to their immigrant parents. Rather, they are incapable of being seen as French by others because of their ethnic origins. So though France promotes an inclusionary national identity through its Republican model, it in fact excludes certain populations despite their citizenship, such as children of immigrants from former French colonies in the Maghreb and elsewhere. France therefore has a growing group of citizens who, despite doing everything quote unquote right, cannot be seen as complete French citizens. This is a minority population that is unable to have their identity affirmed and acknowledged by others, and therefore continually remains in a marginal social location. So France's colorblind ideology veils the difficulties facing marginalized individuals solely based on their race and ethnic origin. So here I'm influenced by, among others, Frantz Fanon, who in Black Skin, White Mass wrote of how the European has a fixed concept of the quote unquote Negro, and therefore how Blacks in France are not seen as of France. In my work, I extend Omni and Wynot's framework of the racial project to France. This framework allows me to consider how people are marked as different and inferior without state-level categories. It also helps to explain the creation and continual maintenance of a quote-unquote racial common sense, in which individuals are marked as distinct in the absence of state categories and those distinctions come to have meaningful consequences. I'm also influenced by French scholar Pat Nadia, who's discussed how Blacks in France are paradoxically and simultaneously visible and invisible. And Trika Keaton, who argues that France's race blindness is coupled with race-based assumptions, which lead to a consciousness of race. I'm also influenced by humanities scholar David Theo Goldberg's framework of racial Europeanization, or how race is often framed as a problem everywhere but in Europe, whereas instead framed as exceptional or related to phenomena of the past, such as the Holocaust. He argues that, quote, the idea of the European excludes those historically categorized as non-European, as being non-white. You're here, but you don't really or fully belong. Your sojourn is temporary, so don't get too comfortable, end quote. Racial Europeanization also illustrates how race and ethnicity are taboo to discuss, yet as my research shows, omnipresent in the lives of individuals marked as non-white. Racial meanings are articulated and hierarchies based on those meanings are still applied. Excuse me. So now I want to provide some examples of this denial of cultural citizenship due to race and ethnicity. Farid, a 29-year-old of Moroccan origin, who lives with his family in the western banlieue of Poissy, feels that his ethnic origin has colored his experiences, including his career working at a bank. He remembers one of his colleagues suggesting that he change his name to one that is more traditionally French, such as Pierre or Jacques. Here he was encouraged to hide one marker of his difference, here his North African sounding name, in order to fit in. He says, quote, they don't want me. They tell me to integrate. Me, I don't want to integrate. I am French. I don't need to integrate. I was born in France. I respect the laws of the Republic. But they still tell us, no, you're not French. You will never be French. They tell us that because our parents have foreign origins, it automatically we do too. We are sometimes obligated to hide our differences as if we were ashamed of them. But I've arrived at an age when I tell myself it's my difference. I'm not looking to put it out front, but I don't want people to tell me to hide it, end quote. Here, Farid identifies what many of my respondents reference, this impossibility of being able to be seen as a full French citizen by others. Another example is Nasser, a 29-year-old of Algerian origin and a practicing Muslim who lives in Nanterre, which is a western banlieue or suburb of Paris. He says, quote, we are sitting between two chairs. Even though I am a manager at my company, I drive an expensive car, etc. I can try to go to a club or something and cannot get in, and then I return to reality. You are never 100% either way. Maybe I'm asking for too much, wanting to be both 100% Algerian and 100% French, but I can't choose between them. I want to combine the best parts of both into something great, but I don't know, I still feel different, end quote. So Nasser is university educated. He did his undergraduate work in France and did his graduate studies in the UK. And he has worked at his present company as both an engineer and a technical director. Because of his professional and educational accomplishments, he feels as though he understands the codes or sets of behaviors necessary for success and mobility in the French workplace and larger French society. However, Nasser realizes that his professional success and the cultural capital that comes with it are not enough to prevent him from the same discrimination and mistreatment that less quote unquote successful children of Maghreb immigrants or immigrants themselves face. Despite his upper mobility vis-a-vis his immigrant parents, his father worked in construction and his mother was a homemaker, and neither had greater than an elementary school level education. Nasser is not removed from occupying a marginal status in larger French society. Quote, if I am walking in a bourgeois Parisian neighborhood and an old French lady sees me, she'll cross the street to walk on the other side. I think it's going to take many more generations for people to not see differences like this, for someone to see a Black person or an Arab walk by in the street and not even notice it, end quote. So with this research, I laid to rest the notion of a French exceptionalism regarding distinctions based on race and ethnicity. The examples of these citizen outsiders reveal how non-white individuals do not get to be French in the sense of having that identity accepted by other French people. They lack the cultural citizenship to actually be accepted as French. This illustrates France's racial project, which creates a racial common sense in a seemingly colorblind society. By focusing on middle class individuals, I demonstrate how being incorporated into French society and being accepted as French by others is not a question of professional or educational accomplishments. This minority population is unable to have their identity affirmed and acknowledged by others. This reveals, among other things, how race and ethnicity operate as master categories shaping boundaries of inclusion and exclusion. In other words, race matters because Maghreb origin individuals and other racial and ethnic minorities are racialized. Race and ethnicity are not legitimated by the state because of Republican ideology, but nonetheless become evident through everyday practices of marginalization and exclusion. Because of this racial formation, non-white immigrant origin individuals will continually be left at a mainstream society, and only a partial assimilation is ever possible. Even though my respondents exemplify what immigrants and their descendants are supposed to do to quote unquote fit in, i.e., work hard, be well educated, hold stable middle class jobs, what is clear is that that's never enough. This is the reality for middle class children of North African immigrants and broader non white individuals today. So my current work, building off of my book, is to consider how a suspect's citizenship or belonging is continually constructed in contemporary French society. So I'm currently conducting ethnographic, currently outside of a global pandemic, conducting ethnographic research on mobilization against police violence against Black and Maghreb origin individuals, which so far has included interviews with activists who are associated with different collectifs or organizations, as well as journalists who reported on some of these issues, and family members of and friends of victims of police violence, some of whom are activists themselves. I'm using anti-racist mobilization and activism against police violence and harassment to examine how state violence is one of the mechanisms that continually reinforces a second-class citizenship or suspect citizenship for these minority populations. So in their activism, these minority populations are responding to a violence that is not new, but rather an extension of the violence of French colonialism. So here I'm in conversation with Akim Mbei's notion of necropolitics, considering the ways that the state has the capacity to determine who is and who is not disposable, or moreover, who does and who can belong or does not belong, as well as Anna Komarov's Agorcha Yurkel's production of non-belonging, Nira Yarl Davis's notion of the politics of belonging, Paul Silverstein's conception of citizenship surveillance through Le Contrôle d'Identité of predominantly Black and middle class and Maghreb individuals, and Damani Partridge's work on the construction of non-citizens and reunified post-1989 Germany, and how they are continually subject to exclusionary incorporation. I'm interested in the ways that people are continually kept on the margins of society and how they mobilize against that. And I use state violence and anti-racist mobilization as a way to understand that. So this relationship between suspect citizenship and state violence can be seen, for example, in the 2005 uprisings throughout many of France's banlieues. Here, Zaid Bena, a 17-year-old of Tunisian origin, and Bana Traoré, a 15-year-old of Malayan origin, pictured here, were electrocuted in a substation as they fled police in Quilly-sous-Bois, a Parisian banlieue. They are apparently trying to avoid the constant contrôle d'identité or identity checks by the police. So outrage about their deaths led to uprisings throughout France, which lasted a few weeks. Then President Jacques Chirac declared a state of emergency, and then Interior Minister and then later President Nicolas Sarkozy called the individuals involved in the uprisings racailles or scum, and suggested cleaning the streets of the banlieue with a crashier, which is a brand of a high-pressure water hose. The police officers involved in the deaths of Zaid and Bona were cleared of all charges related to their deaths over a decade later. These events drew national and international attention to an often ignored segment of the French population. Here are immigrants and descendants of immigrants from former French colonies in various parts of Africa. These uprisings were also heavily covered in the American media, depicted as a quote unquote other France, bemoaning how France's Republican ideology, which does not recognize race and ethnicity as legitimate categories, has failed to include its immigrants and minorities and address or recognize the colonial legacy in parts of Africa and elsewhere. And this is an image from minority protesters with signs saying "we are scum," or sort of taking back the term or reappropriating the term. But it is also helpful to consider how these uprisings and the outrage around them reflect the ongoing problem of state violence in France. A more recent example is the case of Adama Traoré, a 24-year-old, a Black construction worker who died under unusual circumstances after being arrested in a banlieue north of Paris in July 2016. The police first claimed that he died of a heart attack, and then later said he had a severe infection. Assa Traoré, who is pictured here under a photo of her brother, is a 32-year-old sister and is leading the movement for justice for Adama. Since his death, which one American media outlet termed quote unquote Francis Ferguson, there have been numerous demonstrations demanding justice for Adama Traoré, including one every year on the anniversary of his death. And this photo is from one such demonstration in 2018. So Assa and her family are alleging lack of assistance and willful neglect by the police as both contributing to her brother's death, especially since he had no chronic health problems prior to his death. So before her brother's death, Assa was working as a teacher's assistant in another banlieue north of Paris. She has since written 2 books, the sales of which she uses to seek justice for her brother. This includes paying legal fees for 4 of her other brothers. She has 17 total siblings who have been in jail for various periods since Adama's death. She stated publicly that her family has been under attack by the French state ever since they contested the official explanation for Adama's death. So Assa regularly gives talks about police violence in her brother's death, not just in France, but all over the world, and has received support from various celebrities, including French rapper Maccabi and activist and scholar Angela Davis. As she explained to me when we first met in 2017, she sees this cause as not just about justice for her brother, but for all forgotten populations in France, including residents of les quartiers populaires, or working class neighborhoods, who know the police only as a quote unquote invading force. So once when I met her, when she was signing copies of her first book at the offices of Soul, her publisher in Paris, she explained to me, quote, "We don't see people like Adama as a human, a son, a brother. Even I've been controlled, stopped by the police, in these quartiers or neighborhoods. What's happening is France is having an identity crisis. It wants to suppress differences, but you can't do that." Assa's point also speaks to the tensions inherent in French republicanism, as some differences in French society are seen as meaningful and others are not. And this photo is from a demonstration I was a part of in 2017 for another victim of police violence. Another example of this construction of a suspect citizenship in French society is following the massacre at the editorial offices of Charlie Hebdo, a satirical magazine, in January 2015. So in the aftermath of this massacre, a great deal of attention focused on the slain cartoonist and the columnist, and the international slogan "Je suis Charlie" appeared. But another slogan soon also appeared, recognizing another victim of the attacks. Ahmed Marabe, pictured here, was a Muslim police officer of Algerian origin, killed during the attacks while trying to pursue the shooters at the Charlie Hebdo editorial offices. Yet it was Je suis Charlie, however, that was more of an international rallying cry. Je suis Ahmed was a far less common sentiment. The central question about inclusion and belonging, who is and who can be, emblematic citizen upholding the core values of French society, hangs in the gap between these two slogans. In other words, can someone who is not seen as French as not white be the poster child for freedom, tolerance, and democracy in contemporary France and Europe more generally? I also like this quote by Auréa Bouchard, a French activist of Algerian origin, who started the group and political party, Parti d'Indigènes de la République. She says, quote, in her book, "It only takes one generation for an Italian, a Portuguese, or a Pole to become really French, while this dignity will always, in effect, be denied to the old deported Africans who remain relegated to the hexagon or the dusty corners of the empire. As for the metropolis, it parked them on reservations with their children. To Arab to be French, to indigenous to be white. Between white people and us, there is race. It is constitutive of this republic. It will always rise between us," end quote. So to me, this exemplifies, among other things, how race continually structures that nation state, even in this post-colonial era, or rather, as Ori herself refers to it, the quote unquote neo-colonial reality. This is another way of thinking about the quote unquote panic of the post-colonial. France's current anxieties about immigrants, multiculturalism, or even Islam need to be properly situated in this colonial context, specifically in the Maghreb, or the rest of Africa, and parts of Asia and the Caribbean. This should hopefully move us beyond a solely immigrant-focused lens to grappling with how actual citizens are marginalized across Europe because of their race and ethnic origin. Despite ideologies which deny race is salient, race nevertheless structures boundaries of inclusion and exclusion. And this quote also gets at how race and racism structure who can actually belong to French society and whose belonging to societal membership will always be suspect. Of course, we can think about and should think about these questions outside of France. Consider, for example, the juxtaposition of images of Alan Kurdi, the 3-year-old drowned Syrian refugee, found on the shore of Turkey trying to reach Greece in 2015, with a cartoon in the Charlie Hebdo satirical magazine depicting two men chasing two terrified women with the caption, "What would little Alan have grown up to be?" And the answer at the bottom, quote, "an ass groper in Germany," end quote. Oh, wait. Okay. Are the multiple examples of Black Americans who've been killed by the police pictured here, and the growing Black Lives Matter movement, which is challenging, among other things, how Black Americans are never seen as fully human, and is already reverberating, connecting to global movements against racism and state violence, including in France. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. In that sense, we should consider suspect citizenship or suspect belonging as a clarion call for all populations marginalized globally, especially those populations racialized as Black. Thank you.
Yay, we are clapping for you. Thank you so much. That's fascinating. And you have so much lovely photographs and horrifying, but
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think what we're going to do is ask people to raise their blue hand, which I believe as the host, I can't see how you do this, but I think you click on participants and then there's a little button where you can raise your hand, or you can click on your own image.
Yeah, it's like reactions. It's usually.
Okay, or it's maybe reaction. Oh yeah, then it's under reactions too. So many places to raise your hand. If you have a question, please do raise that hand. If you put questions in the chat, we will try to get to those too, but it's always really confusing to do that. Okay, so we're just gonna jump right in. Jennifer Lena.
Should I stop sharing my screen or does it?
Yeah, I think probably you should.
Okay.
Great. Well, first I want to thank you for such a wonderful talk and one that opened up so many great questions. So I hope that mine doesn't take us too far off your course by being sort of focused on the cultural. But when I think about cultural citizenship, sort of the history of its study, I'm reminded, of course, of the map, the census, and the museum. So my question is going to steer towards that last piece and about the point that you make several times in your talk about representations of these immigrants and their children national citizens, their representation in media. I noticed in your images the circulation of the kinds of protest tactics and re-cooptation of language that we see here on the streets in BLM. And I also know from my own life that there is a role here for France's secularization, its prohibition on certain forms of demonstration of religious belief in public. So my question is trying to combine those and say, and ask you to speak a little bit about public representations of these groups in maybe more less formal spaces than museums, but also informal spaces, and how that is playing into these dynamics that interest you.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the question. So just to clarify, when you say these groups, you just mean migrant-oriented individuals, or just non-white people generally, or all of the above kind of thing? Okay.
Well, I'm sorry. I guess I was thinking especially of the people I saw depicted in public action. So maybe I should constrain myself to just that.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, thanks for that question. So yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that. Okay, so as it relates to sort of my kind of a book, and specifically my work on children of migrant immigrants, what came out a lot was sort of thinking about this growth of what's often termed quote unquote banlieue literature or banlieue representation. So in other words, sort of different films and documentaries, novels, poems, etc., from some of these communities, and how that's sort of been, I actually don't talk about it as much in my book as I should have, but and how that's sort of done work to sort of challenge the place of these individuals in French society, and also sort of push back against the very problematic sort of mainstream images of sort of people who live in the banlieues, people who are not white, people who are immigrant, etc. So that's one answer. The other thing I would say that it's sort of interesting in my current stuff and thinking about the sort of the protests, the representations of protests, and then also sort of the representations of Black Lives Matter and how that travels or not, is also sort of thinking about two more points, is thinking about the sort of iconography or connections that folks make between, what I think could broadly be construed struggles for Black liberation in, France versus struggles for Black liberation around the world. So, for example, one of the things that came out in my first book, it was just started my dissertation research, 100 years ago, was sort of the ways in which children of migrant immigrants were making sense of their own social location by thinking about, for example, the autobiography of Malcolm X and these other sort of iconographical figures that are related to the African American civil rights movement. And it wasn't just, I think, it's not irrelevant that I'm a Black person in that space having these kind of conversations, but at the same time, I think it also, I'm not someone who regularly goes around quoting the autobiography of Malcolm X. So it, it wasn't just like totally just me. So I say that to say that, it's interesting how, so that was one answer. And then, I see that sort of continuing and thinking about the movement against police violence, because, some of the iconography, as I showed in some of the photos, directly relates to Black Lives Matter, but also directly relates to earlier periods of, struggles for Black liberation in the United States. So there's a lot of iconography or references to the civil rights movement. There's a sort of, French version of no justice, no peace, like these sorts of things, right? And so I think that's also another way that folks are making sense of how to deal with what is really a global phenomenon, while also paying attention to the very specific context of what's happening in France, because France is very specific, and the sort of local particularities. So that's sort of a long-winded answer, but yeah. So I mean, it's kind of maybe I could talk more about this at some other point, but because it's one of the things I'm trying to also think through, sort of how does that translation work happen, and what does it mean for a sort of a demonstration against the death or for justice for Adama Traoré to sort of include Black Lives Matter, T-shirts, right? And who's doing that work, and what does it mean to have sort of to think about Black Lives Matter in a context when there are literally no Black lives because of French Republican ideology. So yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, okay, thanks.
Great, thank you. Julia Sonnabend.
Hi. Thanks so much for this fascinating, fantastic talk. Really enjoyed it. And I just want to go back to the beginning when you mentioned that white is not a term that your respondents used. And
No, they
obviously,
used, sorry, just to clarify, they used it. They just said it wasn't recognized in French society. Sorry, please go.
a different, okay. So you published a book in English, Citizen Outsider. So that made me think about the translation work that you had to do. And I don't mean it in the narrow sense of kind of linguistic translation, but obviously you said the audience there, it's Anglo-American, it's English-speaking international, and so on. So I'm curious about the translation work. What were the hard parts? Some elements of your story were covered by international media, like the Banlieue protests, but a lot of it isn't. So were there particular challenges in that translation work to write this in English?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, there's a lot I can say about that. So a couple things. I mean, I think I was very when I first started doing this work, was like very conscious of how do I say this? Like being less of an American, in the sense of sort of really like using the language that folks use. And so that's partly why I'm like really clear to clarify that I'm not using the word white because that's like how I was socialized, or, you know, because I'm surrounded by white people, but rather that like, you know, this is a term that, you know, the folks that I interviewed and spent time with were using. And so just really being intentional about the fact that I'm not trying to use, or, you know, US kinds of US terms or phrases or conceptions, but rather these are sort of what they brought to me. And I think that sort of in and of itself is a finding. But, you know, I think I felt like I constantly had to be clear that that's what I was doing, because I think for, yeah, I'm trying to be diplomatic in this response. I think sometimes the way that my work was is sort of received from not just my positionality as a U.S. citizen, but also my positionality as an African American, and the sort of assumptions that folks make about kind of what that means to do work on race, and therefore seeing racism everywhere. But more generally to your translation work, I mean, it's interesting because I find that I normally have to explain, I mean, kind of like I did in this talk, I usually have to do a lot of work to explain what French republicanism is and why it's so different from the US or the UK or any other kind of society, which like when I present this work in Europe, I don't have to do because everyone knows that. Yeah, I mean, I'm making glib generalizations, but so I think I have to spend more time thinking about or explaining the sort of historical context and why French republicanism is so different in a lot of ways from, you know, how other societies think about race, think about identity, et cetera. But then even within those differences, there's a lot of similarities in how folks are like being racialized and experiencing that racialization. So I don't know if that kind of answers your question a bit. I also had I guess the last thing I'll quickly say to that is just the question of like literal terms and being really intentional about not translating everything such as banlieue, because the connotation of suburb is obviously very different in the United States as it is in France and other societies. So I tried to, there are specific terms like that I tried to keep that I did keep in the French, primarily to sort of facilitate some of that translation work. I don't know if that answered your question. Thank you.
Okay, Benoit.
Yes, thank you, Professor Beaman. Benoit Chalon, I'm a colleague of Rachel in the department, and Julia. So I really enjoy your talk, really fascinating detail. I have two add-on questions. One has to do with Europe, and the other has to do again with the question of cultural citizenship as the frame of analysis. The first point about Europe, a lot of things happen in the historical material that you present in the early 2000 and 2010, the last decade. A lot of things happen with regards to suspect citizens at the European level. And I was wondering if there was any lessons that you could share with us when it comes to the question of Europeanization. I mean, as we know, France is an important part of the question of European integration, the transformation that happens with policing the frontier with Frontex, the question of Islamophobia, the 2005 constitution that, you know, Christianity is the root of Europe, etc. So Europe also contributed in making of certain citizens suspects, turning those citizens. So I was wondering whether there is something that you found illuminating or that we should keep in mind. In other words, it's exiting the methodological nationalist perspective, whether it's only a French problem, and how the Europeanization adds a layer for good and bad, I guess mostly for bad. And the other point is with cultural citizenship. I guess I broadly agree with the necessity to look at cultural citizenship, but I wonder sometimes whether it overlooks, there is a risk of overlooking other aspects, legal, political aspects of creating those suspect citizens. You know, it's been a while I have read Theo Goldberg, but I think there's a lot about the interconnection of the race issue with state, the organization of the state. I'm thinking also of the work of Todd Shepard about the invention of decolonization in Algeria. There are a lot of legal continuities. You know, you say, yes, France, the Republic is doesn't mention race, etc. But actually in the legal and administrative measures from the end of the colonial period, you can see that those terms were used specifically to target those who will become the suspect citizens, right? So there is also something here in terms of political sociology that matters. And you know, Todd Shepard also connects it to Europe, this idea of who is European, and Fanon says that, you know, Europe is invented, I don't remember if he says in the colonies or in North Africa, but there is a relation there. And I would like to hear you on those 2 points of cultural citizenship and Europeanization, please.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. And I think I broadly agree. So I guess I'll take them in the opposite order. So the point around cultural citizenship. So yeah, I mean, so part of the reason why I use that as a framework is not because I'm sort of trying to make the argument that legal and political continuities don't matter, but rather that this is a population, that the Maghreb second generation, that is sort of outside of how we normally think about these like European borders, or just, you know, the context of France, these like who belongs to France. So I think there's a lot of important work you know, about sort of the European border zone and the ways that the concept of Europe itself is constructing borders around who sort of legally or technically belongs. And I think that's all sort of, you know, that's all like relevant to what I'm talking about. But I think what I'm trying to do with my work is think about, okay, so people for whom they are literally are not immigrants, like why are they still subsumed into this sort of, you know, outsider immigrant discourse? And so that's why I find cultural citizenship to be really helpful, to make sense of how they are very French. And so maybe I didn't talk about it so much in this talk, but in my book, I talk about how they are very French and very much see themselves as French. They don't see themselves as immigrant, but they're constantly referred to or racialized or termed or framed as immigrants. And so that's why I'm trying to kind of like it's not to negate the sort of legal political context, but rather to say that sort of, you know, because these are people who are already subsumed in that, you know, then what is really going on, right? And how are sort of their experiences different or similar from that of their immigrant parents. So I found cultural citizenship a really fruitful way to do that. So I'm trying to make eye contact with people's faces keep moving around, so that's kind of funny. So yeah, there you are. Okay. Yeah, and so then the first question around, so that's a really good question too, around sort of this like the first question around sort of like how much of this is France and how much of this is Europe, and et cetera. So in some ways, yeah, so I think what's interesting about France relative to Europe is that, you know, France, I'm trying not to speak in generalizations, but like, you know, France imagines itself as Europe, right? And so there's a way in which like what's happening in France is supposed to sort of signify what's happening in Europe. And this is sort of like a very French-centric perspective. So I think that like what is happening in France is only sort of is kind of indicative of what's happening in the rest of Europe. And so France just becomes a place where these battles are more sort of closely playing out because of sort of, you know, French power, because of the sort of, you know, for example, the question of Islam, the idea that France has more Muslims than the rest of Western Europe. And so I think there's a way that like what happens in France is sort of just broadly reflects what's happening in Europe more generally. And I think that's how, so I think that's partly what's happening. But I also think, you know, from the perspective of my respondents around sort of the sort of, you know, is it a French problem or European problem? You know, I think there is less of a sort of reference to Europe as a entity as compared to sort of them being them representing some sort of France as a reference. So I say that to say that like initially when I was first sort of doing fieldwork in France, I thought there'd be more of a sort of reference or connection to some kind of European project writ large or some kind of EU project writ large. And there really wasn't. It was more just a reference to sort of actually being French and needing to be sort of accepted and included as French people versus sort of, you know, being part of the EU or Western Europe or Europe more generally. So thank you.
Okay, then we have Maya and then Auda, and then I'm going to put myself on the list.
Hey, thank you so much for this great talk. I have a question, kind of like a meta question on your research, because there's many ways to, produce a research, and I wonder how you arrive from cultural citizenship into police brutality or vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
Because you could probably approach it in so many other ways. You can talk about the market, you can talk about like symbolism, but it is interesting, that connection. And I wonder also, because my research is very connected to both these ideas, I wonder how you arrived, what was the core and what was like the follow-up. And
okay, thank you. Yeah, so basically what happened was, so I had sort of I've been interested in issues of sort of race and ethnicity and comparative race and ethnicity for a while, and I sort of came to studying it as a career through my own sort of learning the French language, almost 30 years ago, and sort of having my own experiences, having to study abroad, doing a study abroad program there, et cetera, et cetera. So I say that to say that sort of I got interested in what was my dissertation in my first book, based on sort of existing research at the time that was more on, first generation migrants from the Maghreb. I'm thinking about Michel Lamont's work, for example, but less stuff about like the second generation or actual sort of racial ethnic minorities who are born in France. So that's sort of how I found this initial population and kind of went from there. What happened when I was working on copy edits for my book is that I had sorry to hear about the death of Adama Traore. And I heard about it first. The very first time I heard about it was actually in the New York Times. And I found that very curious. And I happened to be in France that summer. So I sort of started to talk to some connections who people who were sort of involved in activist work writ large, and then started to read a lot more about the sort of prevalence of these contrôle d'identité or these police stops, and thinking about how this is a more widespread problem that I had realized. And so I sort of went down, and so ever since then, which has been like a few years now, I've been going down that rabbit hole and sort of interviewing, Asa, who I cited in the talk, but other sort of activists involved in this issue. So it sort of went from it was sort of just me following basically like current events in France that remotely relate to kind of what I'm interested in, and kind of going down that rabbit hole. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but
Thank you, Auda.
Okay, thank you so much, Jen. Thank you so much for your talk, and it was really illuminating for me. And maybe I want to share like a personal experience as a student in France, and I never realized how racist was France for me. I am a Colombian person, so for me it was really like shocking when I was in France and receiving all the racism from that culture. And I start to think that is something, and you highlight this in your talk about the discourse and how the Republican discourse make this kind of thing, that égalité, fraternité, modernité, like égalité, liberté, fraternité, are really important, and this is like the base of the French culture. So I think that is something in the discourse that like prevent them to talk about racism there. So nobody talks about racism. Also, even I take classes in anthropology department, and they told me, and they told me all the time that we don't talk about race here in France. So for me, it was really shocking, that part, and living racism for myself. So it was really, really shocking. So when I arrived here, I started to think that the way in which, I don't know, I'm afraid about like putting like the race analysis, the US race analysis, and going there to France and analyzing the same way racism there and here. So I want to know, because I'm thinking about racism in Latin America, and I don't know how to read racism in Latin America, but because it's different from the United States, and I think that is different from European racism. So I want to know how you did that, how you try to read this racism and this race question there, having lens or having put in some theoretical background from US like analysis that is really interesting, but it's different. So this is my question.
Yeah, thanks for that, and thanks for sharing your experiences that I've heard other people say about sort of just the shock of sort of how racist French society is. I mean, one of the things I think is really interesting, both sort of in French academia or academic spaces, and then also sort of in just French everyday society, is this idea that when you talk about race or racism, you're importing a US concept, right? And it's really interesting. Like even I recently read an interview with Asa, saying that she gets the same retort. So even though she actually is French and she's talking about sort of police violence as an example of racism, or trying to talk about that rather, I should say, she's still accused of being too influenced by Anglo-American ideas or US ideas, et cetera. So it's like, it's really interesting to me that even people who are like literally, I mean, not just me as a sort of outsider coming in doing this work, but even people who are literally on the ground doing this activist work, who actually are Black, who are French themselves, get the same kind of pushback. So I think that that's also like very much reflective. It's why I was thinking about that when you were talking about your experiences taking anthropology classes and sort of the ways in which people are like, we don't talk about race here because race exists everywhere, but in France. So your question is sort of how to think about race in Latin America specifically. So I'm actually teaching a graduate seminar this quarter on race and global migration. And so that's one of the things that we've been talking about a lot the last few weeks, is sort of like, what do you do with different concepts or different sort of theoretical frameworks that come from, region X, and try to think about them in region Y. And one of the things that I've been thinking about, and I think this relates, hopefully this is helpful to your question, but otherwise I'm just sort of talking. No, it's just also to think about, like, I think sometimes, and I sort of think about this in kind of my class, like sometimes we sort of do this work as academics or as scholars where we sort of assume that the nation state boundary is doing more work than it actually is, or doing a particular kind of work. And so I say this to say that, like, when I think about racism in France, it's helpful for me to think about the long history in which there have been these global conversations about racism, race, what is Blackness, et cetera. So in the context of France, there's the movement of negritude, which was not just people physically in France, but was also sort of in conversation with, Harlem Renaissance writers and artists in the United States, and, artists and writers in parts of Africa, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess I say that to say that, like, even when we think about, what is a French conception of racism, that's always confluenced by and sort of influencing other spaces based on sort of people's actual experiences and the connections that they're making. And so I find that really fruitful to think about the present. And so when I think about sort of, how do I know, what's a way to understand racism in France, I think it is helpful to think about, the connections that folks in France are making with, what's happening. So in the context of the work on myself on police violence, there's a lot of conversation with what's happening in terms of, state violence in Brazil, or what's happening with state violence in the United States or the UK, which are like all very different societies with different racial and colonial histories. But nonetheless, I think it's fruitful that people themselves are seeing these other incidents that happen in other countries as synonymous with what's happening in their present country. And so I think there's something, so that's a very long-winded way of saying that I think there's something fruitful to mine from the global connections that folks are both like presently making, but actually have like long been making in history. So hopefully that answered your question.
Okay, I'm going to call on myself, and I encourage people who have questions to raise their hands. Okay, I'm going to say a couple things. I mean, one is I'm just shocked. I feel like people have been, I don't know very much about France, but I feel like people have been saying this about France, for a long time, this idea that there's like no race in France, and, republicanism, and especially like the headscarf and all of this stuff. And this is just a comment, like, it's just shocking to me that that's still happening, right? And there's all of these things that seem so obviously related to race. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking about, like, I think in your response to Auda, you just mentioned like a number of aspects of race and racism, that we could understand race differently in different places, that it operates differently, but that doesn't mean there's no racism, right? It's like the French state is then, and the French anthropology community or whatever is saying, we don't believe in this, therefore we don't have it. And then if you bring it in, you're just like, you're bringing in something from some other culture that's irrelevant, which I kind of remember learning that was also a thing in Brazil, that Brazilian, authorities were like, we don't have racism in Brazil, certainly not like the US, right? But I'm interested in, and it's also even more insane because of the colonial history of France, which you haven't really talked about like that, to think of Algerians, for example, as kind of permanent immigrants is not only to deny race, but also to deny this colonial history, right? So I'm interested in if you have anything to say about that. And I'm thinking about it, this kind of permanent immigrant status, part of the analog to me to that seen in the US seems to be Latinos, not necessarily Black African-Americans or Caribbean immigrants sometimes, but people who have like come from voluntary immigrant, descendants, right? Who are then kind of categorized as not American, and which we've seen a lot of in the last couple of years or whatever. So those are just observations. The thing I want to ask you about is kind of the relationship, like how are you progressing theoretically on the question of suspect citizenship, right? And I think a couple of people have brought up the question of the state. Like, and is there a difference between the thing that's important about the state in a citizen outsider framework, where the thing is about, you know, you belong as a political subject because you're a citizen, versus kind of suspect citizenship, which seems to bring in more about police apparatus and a kind of like punishment and surveillance and I don't know, law enforcement kind of stuff? Or are those just two elements of the same thing, or is there any relation between them? And one thing that I'm thinking about is the class status of the people that you're looking at. So of course it's super interesting that you're looking at middle class, you know, both second generation and middle class. Sounds like some, you know, professional middle class, right? Or even upper middle class.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if the notion of suspect citizenship is different for those people than it is for people with other class backgrounds who are otherwise in the same category. Because, or if it's just like, of course, you know, what you're saying is like the police will approach, you know, a banker, I don't know, banker of Algerian origin or whatever, and say, you know, you don't belong in some way. But are these other kinds of instances that you were talking about in the second half of the talk, is that mediated by class at all? Sorry, that was just like a giant babble, but anything that you want to respond to in there would be great.
Yeah, no, there's a lot there. Thanks. Okay, so yeah, and I think just to kind of so thanks for all of that. So first I would say, and this is also, I guess that's something I should have mentioned with the previous comment as well. So think about like, you know, the ways historically, you know, the US is used as a stand-in for like what racism is. And so this is both used by the French, but Brazil and various other societies. It's sort of like United States is super racist. And so every place that is not the US is not racist. So I think that that's also present, you know, here as well. So I talked about the colonial history more in my book, specifically to talk about, you know, what is particular about these folks. And so what's really interesting to think about, so there's a couple ways I can answer that. So one, I would say that what's interesting to think about is that, you know, my respondents, because their parents are immigrants from French colonies, they actually often, like, not only do they sort of insist upon their Frenchness, they also insist upon their like sort of over Frenchness or very Frenchness or whatever the term would be, in the sense that like they're even more French than the average French person, because like they're, you know, they go back several generations in Algeria or, you know, what have you, right, which was part of France, right? And so it's like this even more, and in some ways that sort of makes it so they're even more upset or frustrated by the fact that they're not seen as French, because it's not just them being born in France or attending French schools, it's like this long generational history. And so you know, so for example, when I was doing some of this work, you know, Nicolas Sarkozy was president, and it was sort of this idea of like, you know, what is the long, how long has Nicolas Sarkozy been French? Well, we've been French a lot longer, and so I think there's always this sort of like reference to this sort of ancestral line that is sort of mediated, obviously, by French colonial empire. So that's a big part of it. Your point around, oh right, so yeah, the other thing I would say to that is, you know, so that's partly why I think this population, the second generation migrant population, is really interesting to think through as well, because they're sort of these like visual reminders of France's colonial empire, which it goes out of its way to ignore and suppress, et cetera, right? So these are people who are constantly like in your, I mean, not constantly, but like theoretically sort of in your face as these sort of like, you know, with this sort of like quote unquote colonial shadow that like makes it very hard for France to pretend that multiculturalism is something that just started, you know, 2 years ago or something, right? So I think it's like that's also partly like the work that goes into both how they're treated and how they sort of understand their treatment. Your point around, so your point around the Latino comparison is interesting too. I mean, I've been thinking about it, or I've thought about it in terms of sort of the framework we have here of this idea of a perpetual foreigner. And so like, you know, someone who's like fourth generation Japanese American is still asked, but where are you really from? And right, and this like happens to my respondents all the time, right? And so this idea of like, you know, so like, where are you from? I'm from Paris, but like, where are you really from? And so I think there's like a similar kind of work of like, you know, who is the actual visual representation of an American, of a French person? It's not someone who's, you know, the daughter of Algerian immigrants. And like, you know, how does that work? Your question around class status, so that so that's interesting too, and maybe that's also a way to answer the question around sort of the kind of transition from citizen outsider to suspect citizenship, which is what I thought your last question was, if I understood correctly. So maybe not, maybe yes, I don't know. Well, correct me, but
Sorry, I just meant that I was totally unclear. So it wasn't like
okay.
misunderstood. I'm
Okay.
saying words.
Okay. Well, okay. But I could, but yeah, I think so. It's interesting because when I first went into this project, I was like not thinking about class as a meaningful variable at all. I was more thinking about like, I want to just, talk to people who are racial and ethnic minorities, who are Maghreb origin, et cetera. And like, I was more focused on like capturing the second generation population. But for various reasons, somewhat related to access issues and so forth, I ended up relying on snowball sampling, which therefore meant that I had a lot of respondents from similar professional networks, et cetera. So I mean, yeah, hence the snowball. And so then when I was sort of working on analyzing all my notes and interview transcripts and such, Mary Patillo was one of my dissertation coaches. And so she's like, oh, actually you could you shouldn't be upset that you didn't get more of a class variation. You should actually exploit the class point, which, obviously makes sense considering her work. And so then I was so that sort of like led me down a different rabbit hole of thinking about like, okay, so I can control, quote unquote, for the socioeconomic status. And these are people who are not marginalized by financial issues and see themselves as pretty much entrenched in the middle class and are well educated. Then what does this open up for understanding how race and ethnicity operate or manifest themselves in French society? So that's how I got to that. So I sort of see the difference or the transition from thinking about citizen outsiders to this kind of suspect citizenship, in the sense that I'm thinking about the suspect citizenship as sort of more broadly than the North African second generation, right? I'm thinking about it just sort of in terms of racial and ethnic minorities in general. And so that is like across class, across immigrant status, across various other things, to think about sort of, how the French state is continually reinforcing who belongs and who doesn't belong. And I think the middle class second generation is a way to think about like, for lack of a sort of subtle way to put it, like, the people who are doing everything, quote unquote, right, or sort of the best sort of exemplars of this French ideology, how are they faring? And I want to think a bit broadly, or I'm hoping to think more broadly beyond just this one group, to this broader sense of processes of who's sort of included or excluded and how that operates. I don't know if that kind of gets to your question, but. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. No, that was a super coherent set of responses to an incoherent set of questions.
It wasn't
Miriam.
incoherent.
You're muted.
Sorry, I just saw that. So, thank you so much for your talk. And I think my question follows on Rachel's and on your great answer to that. So I'm interested in the second project, again, also on police violence and the ways in which I think it seems to me it has to push you beyond the category of citizenship, because it's a struggle, as you're saying. The people facing police violence are the people who are sans papier or undocumented, people who are right now living in, I'm trying to think of the English word, in kind of whatever, in places, they're housing units, basically. I'm thinking of the Gilets Noirs and how they're creating their own uprising that is somewhere between kind of the people who are no borders and the people who are already citizens. So you've got the people who are the no border struggles, you've got the Gilets Noirs, who are for other people that are like the black vests building on the yellow vests, who are undocumented, but joining their struggle in a larger idiom of anti-imperialism, anti-racism, and so on. And how then do they join with the people you're talking about? So it feels like, first of all, I guess it's an empirical question. Do you see them actually joining struggles? When I was there, I did see them actually talking about these things together in a first time. But also then, how much do you go beyond the language of citizenship and immigration and think about a kind of very much of a non-nation state, non-border kind of a world?
Yeah, thanks for both those questions. Yeah, I completely agree. So I also have found that they join struggles, So yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So, in my field work, which that feels so quaint to say because I haven't been on a plane in God knows how long, but so in my fieldwork, there was a lot of sort of different collectives around sort of, ex-victim of police violence, but they would be very clear to make connections with and go to protests for les sans-papiers, les Gilets Noirs, et cetera, et cetera. So like they're very, very directly, it actually les gilets jaunes in some cases too, which is sort of interesting to think through. But so they're sort of, yeah, so directly making a connection to the idea that, you know, state violence harms all of us. And so this isn't just a question of sort of people who are born in France, or this very sort of narrow example of who these victims are. But I think that, and so that's one answer. The second thing I would say around the citizen question is really interesting because I'm trying to think, that's something I've been trying to think through, of sort of like thinking about, you know, citizen outsider and all of these things, like how much should citizenship even matter, and like what are we doing with that? And I always have a sort of kind of a sort of mixed answer to that question, because I think for myself, I want to think about like, how are these activists, or how is the struggle sort of getting people to move beyond the boundaries of the nation state? But at the same time, what's really clear in a lot of my fieldwork data is that they are sort of very much thinking through the nation state. So it's sort of like, you know, so the citizenship matters because it's like, it matters to them, not so much like I want to make an argument that it matters, if that makes any sense. That distinction makes any sense. I'm not sure it does. But I mean, I say that to say that like, I sort of like, even when they're making connections, so for example, even when activists are making connections to, you know, police violence happening in the United States. So to give one example, you know, the death of Michael Brown in 2014, right? But like, they're still doing that. They're still saying, oh, police violence happens to Black people here in the US and happens to Black people in France, but they're still doing it from a perspective of we were just as French as anyone else, or we still want to be included in French society as anyone else. And so I'm trying to think through like the implications of what that means for thinking about like, you know, I don't want to sort of reify citizenship status or nation state boundaries as like the most important, but it's like very interesting to me that people continually sort of implicitly and explicitly remind me that that's how they're thinking through things, even when they're making these local connections. So that's kind of not, I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but that's like, it's helpful. It's interesting you brought that up, because it's one of the things I'm trying to kind of make sense of, both in terms of how I'm understanding what's happening and what I think people are telling me they think is happening. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. Any other questions? And just to say, I mean, what occurs to me about that is like, it's a kind of methodological thing, right? Of like respecting the perspective of your informants and their worldview, even while not wanting to reify like a sort of troublesome political category. Okay. Oh, Jen, Lena.
I just thought, since you offered us another chance at this, I'm curious, I guess the question I was trying to, the problem with asking your question first is that you're totally incoherent, so I apologize for that.
No,
I was trying to drive at a question in there about secularization, about laïcité. And that question was driven by maybe an instinct that could be wrong. So I want to kind of walk back a step further and give you more leeway and ask about sources of conflict within the community that you were studying in the book, about the obstacles that may be perceived to exist from fellow members, if you catch my meaning. So I was wondering whether religious affiliation and opinions about laïcité and how it may limit public expressions of community might play a role in that. But I think it's better for me to ask the broader question of you about sources of internal conflict.
Yeah. So, okay. So you mean sources of internal conflict in my book, or the stuff I'm doing now, or the book?
Yeah, I'm interested in the book, but you can simply say to me, read the book again if it's in there.
No, I don't know. I just want to clarify, because I feel like I have a tendency to answer wrong questions, and then someone's like, that's not what I was saying. Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, there wasn't as much sources of conflict, I think, would be about sort of what do you do, where do we go from here? So in the sense of, you know, my respondents generally feeling like they see themselves as French, but they're not accepted as French by others, you know, where do they go from here, right? And so some of them, you know, are even saying, well, maybe we'll have to actually leave France and go elsewhere because there's no sort of project for full kind of incorporation or inclusion in French society, versus other people sort of doubling down, if you will, on their Frenchness, on their right to be here, on their right to sort of be as French as anyone else. So that was one tension I saw. Another tension I saw also, or sort of source of conflict among the group in my book, was around their childhood experiences. So I said it, I guess I can say more about this. I did the bulk of this research in, you know, the Parisian metropolitan area, but the bulk of my respondents didn't grow up themselves in the Paris metropolitan area. They grew up in, you know, various small towns and, you know, relocated to Paris primarily for university or other or work-related reasons. And so they also had very different experiences growing up, particularly if like, you know, I have a couple of respondents who grew up in Marseille, which is much more diverse in terms of race and ethnic origin, and they had different experiences figuring out what it means to be French versus, you know, other respondents who were like the only non-white family in their small town, you know, in the middle of France, right? And so there was a lot of sort of like both thinking through what those childhood experiences mean and how they inform what happens or what's happened to them in adulthood in France, and also relatedly how their parents and other relatives tried to explain what those differences meant. So I saw a lot of variation in the sort of early childhood experiences and how they made sense of those experiences. Did I answer? Okay.
Okay, I think we've come full circle. Thank you, everybody. And thank you so much, Jean. How about we unmute and just give Jean a round of applause?
Thank you so much for coming this morning. I'm sorry again for the technical issues.
Oh, that was great. And we really appreciate you being here. And thank you, everyone. Come back next time.